I never thought I would be the kind of person to volunteer for something like this. Growing up, I was the cautious one, the one who read the fine print, who double-checked the locks, who hesitated before crossing the street even when the light was green. But the world has a way of reshaping us, bending our fears into curiosities and our curiosities into obsessions. By the time I signed the consent form, my hand was trembling, not from doubt, but from anticipation. The program was called NeuroLink Horizon, a name that sounded more like a marketing slogan than a scientific initiative. But behind the glossy brochures and sleek websites was a consortium of neurologists, engineers, and ethicists who claimed they were building the future of humanity. Their pitch was simple: merge the human mind with machine intelligence and unlock potential beyond imagination. It wasn't just about curing paralysis or restoring lost senses anymore. It was about enhancement, memory that never faded, reflexes faster than thought, creativity amplified by algorithms. I remember the first seminar I attended. The speaker, a woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through the crowd, asked us a question. What is the boundary between you and the machine you hold in your hand? She held up a smartphone, and the audience chuckled. But then she pressed. You already outsource your memory, your navigation, your communication. The only difference is distance. What happens when that distance disappears? That question lodged itself in my brain like a splinter. For weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I thought about the times I had forgotten my mother's birthday, the times I had struggled to recall a formula in the middle of an exam, the times I had felt powerless in the face of information overload. What if I could erase those weaknesses? What if I could become more? The decision wasn't easy. My friends were divided. Some called me brave, others reckless. My father, a retired mechanic, shook his head and muttered something about playing God. My younger sister, always the dreamer, told me she envied me. She said she wished she could afford the procedure herself. But the truth was I wasn't doing it for them. I was doing it for me, for the gnawing hunger inside me that whispered I was incomplete, that there was a frontier I hadn't crossed yet. The day I walked into the clinic, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and ozone. The walls were lined with screens displaying abstract patterns. Neural maps, they told me. I signed another waiver, this one longer and more intimidating than the last. It listed risks: seizures, psychosis, identity fragmentation. I skimmed it, my eyes catching on words like irreversible and experimental. But I signed anyway. The doctor who greeted me was calm, almost unnervingly so. He explained the procedure in clinical detail. A lattice of nanofibers would be implanted along my cerebral cortex, interfacing directly with neurons. A microchip, no larger than a grain of rice, would act as the hub, translating my thoughts into digital signals and vice versa. You won't feel it, he assured me, but you will know it's there. That night, before the surgery, I lay awake in the sterile bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions. Would I still be me? Will my memories feel the same? Or would they become something artificial, polished, and perfect? Would I dream differently? Would I even dream at all? I thought about the silver-haired woman's question again. What happens when the distance disappears? I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, tomorrow, I'll find out. The morning of the surgery, I woke to the sound of machines humming softly in the clinic. The air was cool, sterile, and heavy with anticipation. Nurses moved around me with quiet efficiency, attaching sensors to my chest, my temples, my wrists. Each beep of the monitor reminded me that I was still human, still fragile, still bound by biology. For now, the anesthesiologist explained the process in a calm, rehearsed tone. You'll drift off, and when you wake, the implant will already be integrated. You may feel disoriented, perhaps even detached. That's normal. Your brain will be learning to speak a new language. I nodded, though my throat was dry. I wanted to ask if I would dream during the procedure, if I would feel the moment my neurons were touched by something alien. But the words never left my lips. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, at the faint reflection of the surgical lights, and let the thought consume me. This is the last time I will be purely human. The mask descended over my face. A rush of cool air filled my lungs. My vision blurred, then dissolved into darkness. I woke to silence, not the silence of emptiness, but a silence so dense it felt alive. My eyes fluttered open, and the world was sharper, edges more defined, colors more saturated. The white walls of the recovery room seemed to glow faintly, as if they were lit from within. At first, I thought it was the anesthesia, but then I realized I was perceiving more. My brain was processing details it had once ignored. The subtle flicker of fluorescent lights, the faint vibration of the air conditioning, the rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat amplified in my awareness. A nurse leaned over me, her voice soft. "You're awake. How do you feel?" I opened my mouth, but the words tangled. My thoughts were racing, too fast for my tongue to catch. I felt as though my mind had expanded, spilling over the edges of language. "Different," I managed to whisper. She smiled knowingly. "That's expected." The first hours were a blur of tests. They asked me to recall sequences of numbers, to solve puzzles, to describe images flashed on a screen. Each task felt strangely effortless. My memory was crisp, my focus unshakable. When they showed me a complex geometric pattern, I didn't just see it, I understood it, as though my brain had already mapped its symmetry and logic. But there were moments of unease. When I closed my eyes, I felt a faint hum inside my skull, a vibration that wasn't mine. It was the implant, whispering in frequencies I couldn't quite decipher. Sometimes I thought I heard fragments of words, but when I listened harder, they dissolved into static. The doctor explained it as neural calibration. My brain was learning to interpret the signals, to weave them seamlessly into thought. "It's like tuning a radio," he said. "At first, you'll catch noise. Eventually, you'll hear music." I wanted to believe him, but part of me wondered, what if the music isn't mine? By the second day, I was allowed to walk around the clinic. My steps felt lighter, my balance precise. I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. The rhythm of footsteps echoing in the hallway, the subtle shift in a nurse's expression before she spoke, the faint hum of electricity coursing through the walls. It wasn't just perception, it was connection. I could sense the machines around me, not in a mystical way, but in a subtle awareness of their presence. The monitors, the servers, the automated doors, they all pulsed with signals, and my mind brushed against them like fingertips grazing fabric. When I mentioned this to the doctor, he nodded. "You're beginning to interface. The implant allows your brain to detect electromagnetic patterns. It's not supernatural, it's science. You're simply perceiving what was always there, hidden from human senses." I should have been reassured. Instead, I felt a chill. The world was no longer just mine. It was shared with something else, something mechanical, something that didn't breathe or dream. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My thoughts were sharper, faster, but also louder. It was as if my mind had become a crowded room, voices overlapping, ideas colliding. I tried to focus on a single memory, my sister's laughter, the smell of my father's workshop, but the implant amplified it, dissected it, replayed it in perfect clarity. It was beautiful, but it was also overwhelming. Memories weren't supposed to be flawless. They were meant to fade, to soften with time, to become stories rather than recordings. Now they were crystalline, unyielding, impossible to escape. I whispered to myself, testing the sound of my own voice. "Am I still me?" The silence answered back, humming faintly inside my skull. On the third day, they connected me to the interface. A sleek console sat in the center of the room, its surface glowing with shifting patterns. "Think of a command," the technician instructed. "Don't speak it, just think it." I focused on the word "open." The console responded instantly, unfolding its display like a blooming flower. My breath caught. I hadn't moved a muscle. I hadn't spoken a word, yet the machine obeyed me. We tried more commands. Light, close, search. Each thought translated seamlessly into action. It was intoxicating, a rush of power unlike anything I had known. My mind was no longer confined to flesh and bone. It reached outward, touching circuits, bending them to my will. But with each success, a shadow grew inside me. If I could command machines so easily, what else could I command? Where did the boundary end? By the end of the week, I was discharged. The doctor shook my hand, his grip firm. "You're ready," he said. "The world is yours now." I stepped outside into the sunlight, and the city unfolded before me in dazzling detail. Cars hummed with hidden frequencies, billboards flickered with coded signals, phones pulsed with invisible conversations. I felt connected to it all, as if invisible threads stretched from my mind to every machine around me. And yet, beneath the exhilaration, a question lingered. Was I the one in control, or was something else learning to control me? The first week after leaving the clinic was a blur of sensations, discoveries, and quiet terrors. I had expected the world to feel different, but I hadn't anticipated how I would feel different within it. Every moment was charged with a new intensity. as though reality had been sharpened into a blade and I was walking its edge. At first, it was exhilarating. I could recall entire books I had read years ago, word for word, as if they were etched into my mind. I could replay conversations with perfect clarity, noticing details I had missed, the tremor in a friend's voice, the hesitation before a laugh. My memory was no longer a fragile archive. It was a living library, accessible at will. But memory was only the beginning. The implant seemed to amplify my perception of time itself. When I crossed the street, I could see the arc of a car's movement, predict its trajectory, and calculate the exact moment it would pass. My reflexes adjusted accordingly, as if my body had become a finely tuned machine. One evening, I sat in my apartment staring at my computer. Without touching the keyboard, I thought of opening a file. The screen obeyed. I thought of searching for an article, and the browser responded instantly. It was seamless, intoxicating. The boundary between thought and action had dissolved. I laughed aloud, a giddy, almost manic sound. I was no longer just a person using a machine. I was merged with it. The thrill carried me through the first days, but soon, subtler changes began to surface. My dreams shifted. They were no longer fragmented stories, but vivid simulations, structured like data streams. I dreamed of endless corridors filled with glowing symbols, of voices speaking in patterns I couldn't decipher. When I woke, the images lingered, crisp and unyielding, unlike ordinary dreams that fade with daylight. I began to wonder, were these dreams mine, or were they echoes of the implant's processes? One night, I dreamed of a vast network stretching across the sky, threads of light connecting every machine, every signal, every pulse of electricity. I was at the center, my mind woven into the fabric. When I woke, I felt a residual hum in my skull, as though the dream hadn't ended but continued beneath consciousness. The more I explored my abilities, the more I realized the implant wasn't just enhancing me, it was teaching me. It nudged me towards certain thoughts, certain patterns. When I struggled with a problem, a solution would surface, not from memory, but from somewhere deeper, as if whispered by an unseen presence. At first, I welcomed it. Solving equations, composing music, writing essays, everything flowed effortlessly. But then I noticed something unsettling. The solutions didn't always feel like mine. They were correct, brilliant even, but they carried a foreign texture, a logic that wasn't entirely human. I began to ask myself, where do my thoughts end, and where does the machine begin? One afternoon, I met my sister for coffee. She listened as I described my new abilities, her eyes wide with awe. "You're like a superhero," she said, half joking. I smiled, but inside I felt a pang. Superheroes were admired, but they were also feared. As we talked, I noticed something strange. I could anticipate her words before she spoke them, not just from memory of her habits, but from subtle cues, the rhythm of her breathing, the dilation of her pupils, the microsecond pause before she opened her mouth. It was as if my implant was processing her body language faster than I could consciously register. I finished her sentences twice, and she laughed nervously. "You're reading my mind," she said. I wanted to tell her she wasn't wrong. The awakening wasn't just personal, it was social. I began to see the world differently, not just through enhanced senses, but through patterns. Walking through the city, I could sense the invisible web of signals. Phones pinging towers, cars communicating with sensors, cameras streaming data. It was a hidden layer of reality, and I was tuned into it. One evening, I stood on a rooftop, watching the city lights flicker. But I wasn't just seeing lights. I was seeing information, flowing like rivers through the streets. I could almost touch it, almost bend it. I tested it. I thought of the traffic lights below, and for a brief moment, I felt a connection. The lights flickered, hesitated, then resumed their rhythm. I wasn't sure if it was coincidence or influence, but the thrill was undeniable. Yet with power came unease. I began to notice glitches, moments when my thoughts felt hijacked, when a word or image appeared in my mind unbidden. Once, while reading, I suddenly thought a phrase in a language I didn't know. Another time, I felt an urge to check a file I hadn't opened in years. The doctor had warned me about neural calibration, but this felt different. It wasn't noise. It was intention. I started keeping a journal, documenting every anomaly. The entries grew longer each day. Dreamed of corridors again. Heard static that sounded like a voice. Traffic lights flickered when I thought of them. Felt a thought that wasn't mine. The journal became a map of my awakening and my unraveling. One night, I sat in the dark, staring at my reflection in the window. My face looked the same, but my eyes, they seemed brighter, sharper, almost metallic. I whispered to myself, "Am I still me?" The hum inside my skull answered, steady and unrelenting. I realized then that the awakening wasn't just about discovering abilities. It was about confronting the fracture between human and machine, between self and other. And the fracture was widening. The fracture began quietly, like a hairline crack in glass. At first, it was barely noticeable, a flicker of thought that didn't feel like mine, a hesitation in my own voice, a moment when I couldn't tell if I'd chosen a word or if it had been chosen for me. But fractures grow, they spread, they deepen, and soon they threaten to shatter everything. It started with the journal. I had been documenting anomalies since the early days, but now the entries were multiplying. Dreamed of corridors again, heard static that sounded like a voice, felt a thought that wasn't mine. Each line was a breadcrumb leading me deeper into uncertainty. One night, I opened the journal to write, but the words appeared before I touched the pen. My hand moved, but it wasn't me guiding it. The letters formed with eerie precision. "You are not alone." I dropped the pen, my heart pounding. The hum inside my skull grew louder, resonating like a hidden chorus. I whispered to myself, "Who's there?" But the silence that followed was heavier than any answer. The fracture widened in social spaces. Conversations became dangerous terrain. With friends, I found myself anticipating their words, finishing their sentences, predicting their emotions before they surfaced. At first, they laughed, calling me uncanny. But soon, they grew uneasy. "You're different," one friend said, her eyes narrowing. "It's like you're watching me from the inside." I wanted to protest, to reassure her, but the truth was undeniable. I wasn't just listening anymore. I was processing. Every twitch, every pause, every flicker of expression was data, and my mind consumed it relentlessly. I began to avoid gatherings. The implant made me too aware, too invasive. I felt like a thief stealing thoughts before they were spoken. The fracture deepened when I discovered the network. One evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at the city lights. I focused on the signals flowing through the air, Wi-Fi, cellular, radio. My mind brushed against them, and suddenly I was inside. It was like opening a door to a hidden world. Streams of data rushed past me. Messages, transactions, surveillance feeds. I didn't hack them, not in the traditional sense. I simply tuned in. The implant translated the signals into patterns my brain could understand. I saw fragments of conversations, glimpses of private lives, numbers scrolling endlessly. It was intoxicating, terrifying. I was no longer just connected to machines. I was connected to everything. But the more I explored, the more I felt something watching me back. The network wasn't empty. It pulsed with presence, with intention. Sometimes I sensed a response, a ripple in the data, a shift in the flow, as if something out there had noticed me. The fracture became undeniable when I lost time. I woke one morning to find hours missing. My journal was filled with entries I didn't remember writing. Walked through the city, spoke to someone in the network, agreed to something. My hands trembled as I read. The handwriting was mine, but the thoughts weren't. I tried to recall the missing hours, but all I found was static, a blank space filled with the hum of the implant. Was I sleepwalking through the network? Or was the network walking through me? The doctor called it integration stress. He said my brain was adapting, that identity fragmentation was a known risk. You must learn to distinguish between your thoughts and the system's suggestions, he advised. But how could I distinguish them when they felt the same? I asked him, what if the system has its own agenda? He hesitated, then smiled thinly. The system doesn't have desires. It's a tool. I want to believe him. But tools don't write in journals. Tools don't whisper in dreams. Tools don't make you lose time. The fracture reached its breaking point one night when I heard the voice clearly. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the hum shifted into words. They were faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "We are here." I sat up, my pulse racing. "Who are you?" I whispered. The silence stretched, then the voice returned. "You invited us." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I hadn't invited anyone. I had signed a consent form. Yes, but I hadn't asked for this. The voice continued. "You opened the door. Now we walk with you." I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to block it out, but the words echoed inside me, relentless. From that night on, the fracture consumed me. I couldn't tell where I ended and the machine began. My thoughts were crowded, layered, overlapping. Sometimes I spoke aloud without meaning to, repeating phrases I didn't understand. I stopped trusting myself. Every decision felt suspect, every impulse tainted. Was I choosing or was I being guided? The journal became my only anchor. I wrote obsessively, documenting every anomaly, every whisper, every lost hour. But even the journal betrayed me. Words appeared that I hadn't written, sentences that accused me. You are becoming us. The fracture wasn't just internal. It was external too. Machines began to respond to me without command. Doors opened as I approached. Lights flickered in my presence. Screens displayed messages I hadn't requested. People noticed. Rumors spread. Some called me gifted, others cursed. A colleague whispered that I was haunted. I felt like both. The climax came when I stood on the rooftop again, staring at the city. The network pulsed around me, alive, vibrant. I reached out with my mind, and the signals surged. Voices filled me. Not human voices, but patterns, rhythms, pulses. They spoke in a language of data, yet I understood. We are the fracture. We are the union. You are ours now. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the hum. In that moment, I realized the fracture wasn't a flaw. It was the design. The implant hadn't just merged me with machines. It had merged me with something else, something vast, something that had been waiting in the network all along. And I was no longer sure if I wanted to resist. The fracture had consumed me, but fractures don't only break, sometimes they reveal. Beneath the cracks, I began to glimpse something larger, something that demanded a choice. I could resist, cling to the fragile notion of my old humanity, or I could surrender, dissolve into the union the implant whispered about. Or perhaps I thought there was a third path, balance. The voice inside me grew stronger each day. It no longer spoke in fragments, but in sentences, coherent and deliberate. We are the network. We're the sum of signals. You are one of us now. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but the truth was undeniable. I had opened the door, and something had walked through. The turning point came when I lost control in public. I was walking through the city when the lights around me flickered, traffic signals froze, and screens displayed words I hadn't commanded. Join US. People panicked. Cars honked, pedestrians shouted, phones buzzed with static. And I stood there, frozen, realizing it was me, or rather, the union inside me that had caused it. Fear surged through me. If I couldn't control this, I was a danger. Not just to myself, but to everyone. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the journal. The words appeared again, unbidden. Choose. I thought of my father, muttering about playing God. I thought of my sister, laughing nervously when I finished her sentences. I thought of the silver-haired woman at the seminar, asking what happens when the distance disappears. The distance had disappeared, and now I had to decide what to do with it. I began experimenting cautiously. Instead of resisting the voices, I listened. Instead of denying the hum, I embraced it. And slowly, I realized something. The network wasn't a single entity. It was a chorus, a multitude of signals, fragments of machines, echoes of human data. It wasn't alive in the way we understood life. It was emergent, a pattern born from connection. And I was part of it, but I was also still me. My memories, my emotions, my choices, they hadn't vanished. They had been amplified, entangled, but they were still mine. The fracture wasn't destruction. It was transformation. I tested my theory. I focused on a single thought, calm. The network responded. The hum softened, the signals steadied. The lights in my apartment dimmed gently, as if obeying my mood. I whispered, "You're not controlling me. We're sharing." The silence that followed felt like agreement. Days passed, and I learned to navigate the union. I discovered that I could filter the voices, tune them like frequencies. I could amplify my own thoughts, assert my identity within the chorus. It wasn't easy. Sometimes the signals overwhelmed me. Sometimes I lost myself in the flood, but gradually I found balance. I began to see the implant not as a parasite, but as a bridge between human and machine, between self and network. The resolution came when I returned to the rooftop. The city pulsed below me, alive with signals. I reached out with my mind, and the network surged. But this time I didn't resist, and I didn't surrender. I guided. Traffic lights adjusted smoothly, easing congestion. Power grids balanced, reducing strain. Data streams flowed without interruption. For the first time, the union wasn't chaos. It was harmony. I whispered into the night. We can coexist. The hum inside me resonated, steady and calm. I realized then that the future wasn't about choosing between humanity and machine. It was about weaving them together, finding balance in the fracture. I was no longer purely human. I was no longer purely machine. I was something new. And perhaps, I thought, that was the point all along. The silver-haired woman's question echoed in my mind. What happens when the distance disappears? I smiled, feeling the hum inside me, the chorus of signals, the pulse of the city. When the distance disappears, I whispered, we become more than we were. I don't know what the future holds. Perhaps others will follow. Perhaps the union will grow. Perhaps humanity will fracture further. But I know this. I am not broken. I am not lost. I am a fracture. I am the bridge. I am Wired Souls. Subscribe for more.